I wrote this book, which has 3 covers and 2 titles. I'm not sure why. But it's about one thing. And the thing it's about is called design thinking. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with it. I'm going to talk a little bit about design thinking today because I think it's kind of relevant to probably whatever you're doing. But I didn't know really what it was initially. And so the very first question I had to deal with as a writer was, what the hell is design thinking? And it's actually it's a subject that's kind of hot right now in the business world. It's being talked about a lot at Stanford University and the Harvard Business School. There's a design firm called IDEO that's promoting it. And basically, as I was trying to figure out what it was, I kept coming upon all these sort of theories, very complex theories and terminology and jargon. And I finally ended up deciding that this was the definition I like. And it's pretty much, that's what it is. That's what design thinking is, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. I studied designers who happen to be great innovators to see how they go about innovating and how they go about bringing about change. And one of the interesting things I did was I studied all kinds of designers, not just like graphic designers or whatever. I studied anybody who designs anything. And I started with, oh, by the way, I first want to say that something interesting occurred to me as I was doing this, as I was studying the way designers think. I realized that, at least in my mind, the way I was seeing it, it was sort of like a dance. So I started referring to it as the catalyst dance because I was realizing that the way designers solve problems, they kind of move backwards and they move laterally, and they're thinking about solutions in a pattern that very much made me think about a dance. And so I've sort of come up with this metaphor that I'll talk a little bit about today. But anyway, to get back to who I was studying and the kinds of designers I was studying, basically everybody. I mean, I started with this guy, Bruce Mau, who some of you may be familiar with, a really interesting guy who designs everything from books to buildings to, interior spaces, you name it. Recently, he was asked to redesign the city of Mecca by Saudi Arabia, which is a pretty big job. And then I interviewed for a long time and studied this guy, Yves Berger. And I don't know if some of you remember or are familiar with the One Laptop Per Child program, which was pretty interesting. Yves was like the lead designer on that. And he also designs tons of other really, really interesting stuff. I interviewed and studied this guy, Van Phillips, who is a guy who designs prosthetic limbs, which I thought that was kind of cool. And then by the time I got into it, I just kept studying, and interviewing more and more designers, and I ended up with like 100, designers who I refer to as the glammerati in the book. And they cover all kinds of ranges and disciplines. I mean, graphic designers, web designers, user experience designers, architects, you name it. And so they're kind of designing everything from, the humble potato peeler to the gigantic building, and in between websites and everything else. So for me, one of the challenges was, all right, what do these people have in common? Like when you have people who are designing so many different things, is there any common thread? Is there anything that links them all together? And that's kind of what I was looking for. As I did this, I found myself going deep into the world of design. It was kind of like going into the design jungle. And it was interesting. I observed that designers are really their own species. For one thing, they have their own language. Designers use really funky and cool terms like chunking and affordance and forgiveness. Forgiveness, I learned, is you design a computer with 4 feet of forgiveness. That means if you drop it 4 feet, it won't break. All kinds of cool stuff like that. They also are, I discovered that designers have some sort of idiosyncrasies that are kind of interesting, like they are extremely communal. Designers like to huddle together. They probably have more or host more conferences than any human beings alive. There's a design conference going on like every 15 minutes. But in spite of that, in spite of the fact that they're very communal, they also they're competitive, and they sometimes can suddenly turn on each other and attack one another, and which usually happens in the design blogs. But idiosyncrasies and the little quirks aside, what I was really looking for are sort of the bigger things. Like what do these guys all do that helps them get to innovation? And that's really what my book was about. And by the way, when we talk about innovation, that term gets used a lot these days. It's sort of the buzzword, and it gets used sometimes pretty loosely. And so I think it's important to think about what innovation is. And from my perspective, innovation is something original that also has an impact. If you design something original but nobody cares, it's not an innovation. And if nobody uses it, it doesn't change anything. It's not an innovation. So that's kind of the definition, and it's a hard thing to achieve. And a lot of us are trying to achieve it on some level, in some field, whatever we're working on. This is kind of what we're trying to do. So I was looking at, how do people who are professional innovators and some of the best in the world, which is what I was looking at, how do they get to this? And obviously there's a million different ways, right? We all create differently, we all solve problems differently. But I did find there were 4 things that really stood out for me that were kind of the steps that seemed to get a lot of these designers to innovation. And they were questioning. These innovators are really good at asking questions. Caring, and I'll explain what I mean by that. Combine, and commit. Now, these were the 4 steps that tended to be very common in the process I was finding that led up to innovation for these designers. Let me start with the first one, questioning. I found that a lot of designers, when they're trying to innovate and solve problems, start by asking stupid questions. And when I say stupid questions, well, what do I mean by a stupid question? I'm not really talking about a question that's stupid. I'm more talking about a question that other people think is stupid, and they think it's obvious or they think it's crazy, and it turns out to be brilliant. And it's amazing how many innovations start with somebody asking a stupid question. In the case of, I think I mentioned, I studied Van Phillips, who is a designer of prosthetic limbs. Okay, Van Phillips, interesting story. He was 21 years old at the time, and he was an athlete. He was a runner, and he was out water skiing one day and had an accident. He actually got sideswiped by a boat and cut off the bottom part of his leg. So he ends up in the hospital, and in the hospital they give him a prosthetic foot, which at the time was, sort of the standard thing, and it was this blocky thing made of wood and foam, and it just didn't work very well, and he was extremely dissatisfied with it right from the get-go. I mean, this was a guy who was an athlete, after all, and he just was thinking, this thing doesn't work for me. And he began to sort of ask stupid questions like, why can't a prosthetic foot behave like a real foot? Why can't it have some of the same characteristics? And at the time, this was a very stupid question because, all the experts said, cannot be done, no way. Too complicated, you can't possibly mimic a human foot and what it does. And so Van Phillips, who was not a designer, became a designer so that he could basically answer his own stupid question, which is what he did. And he ended up designing this thing called the cheetah prosthetic foot, which has actually been quite revolutionary. So I found this time and time again that when I studied these designers, that so often it would start off with their ability to question and the ability to ask really questions that nobody else was willing to ask or thought to ask, questions that were really bold and that were crazy on a certain level. And I think it's funny because this is kind of known about designers in a way. In fact, there's a joke that designers tell about one another, which is how many designers does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer is, does it have to be a light bulb? Because it's just the mindset of these people to say, you know, don't assume anything. Don't assume that, you know, it has to be a light bulb. There may be another way. So I think that ability to question that seemed to me to be the starting point. It's also interesting that that's really hard to do. It's really hard to question. I mean, I'm sort of studying that more and more now, and why it's so hard to question. And I think, you know, I think the reason is that we're taught not to question. You know, in boardrooms, you're not supposed to ask crazy questions or stupid questions because it slows down the meeting, right? In school, you're not supposed to ask crazy questions. In school, you're supposed to answer questions, right? You're supposed to memorize the answer and raise your hand and give it. So sort of throughout every stage of life, we're kind of taught not to do this thing, which actually is the first step to innovation. And it's kind of interesting. The other thing I've realized about questioning, and this brings us back to the idea of a dance, you know, that sort of dance metaphor that I had in my head, is that when you question, you actually take a step back. Because you have to step back from sort of what people are thinking at the time and re-examine and reassess and reconsider. And that backward step is actually really hard to do, but it's also the way I see it, it's the first step in this innovator's dance. It's this backward step so you can reconsider, reframe, look at the problem differently. You know, and sort of it's the time when you step back and ask, why are we doing things the way we've been doing them the last 20 years? Does it really make sense? You know, what if we turn the whole thing upside down? And that is the kind of the starting point. So that's the first step. The second step that I observed, at least in a lot of the cases, was it had to do with, you know, once you've asked the questions and you start to try to answer it maybe, about doing something differently or better, you have to do a lot of observation. You have to watch, you have to listen, you have to pay attention. You have to really get outside your world and find out what's going on with people. And so many of the innovations and the new developments I studied were partly based on the designer getting out there and doing this, which I refer to in the book, caring. Okay, which sort of to me encompasses all of this, you know, understanding, observing, empathizing. It all comes down to caring, you know, caring about what's going on in the world outside of your world and caring about what people need right now and whether there might be a way to deliver on those needs. So that kind of became, to me, the second step in this dance. And when you do this, when you get out there and you begin to observe and, you know, there's all kinds of techniques that professionals use, but really anyone can do it. When you get out there and observe, you begin to get insights, and those insights are sort of the fuel for what becomes innovation. So a lot of the companies I studied do this in interesting ways, and they do it with things that, you know, you might, small things. I studied the company OXO, right, which makes the really cool housewares and kitchenwares. They make the great potato peeler that feels so good in your hand. I don't know if you've seen it. They also recently were developing a new measuring cup. Now, a measuring cup, you would think, you know, what can you do with a measuring cup, right? How do you innovate a measuring cup? Right? It's so basic. And what they ended up doing, what the designers ended up doing, was actually going into kitchens and watching people as they used a measuring cup. And what came out of that was this, you know, incredibly simple insight that they'd never thought of before, which is that when you use a measuring cup, the measurements are all on the side of the cup. And because of that, every time you use the cup, you have to bend over sideways and look at the cup, look at the side of the cup. And it's a real pain, you know, for anyone using a measuring cup. So that is something that if you ask people in a focus group, you know, how's your measuring cup? Anything we could do to improve it? You know, they would probably say, my measuring cup's fine. But when you actually use this kind of observation, you see things that people don't even realize, that people couldn't even tell you. So I think that's why, you know, this step is so critical. And it becomes the in terms of the dance, the idea of the dance in my head, this crazy idea, this caring step, I see it as the third step, and it's a step together. Or rather, it's a step out. It's the second step. It's a step out. So you've stepped back. That's the first step, to sort of ask question and reconsider. Then you have to kind of step out. You kind of have to step outside of your own realm, your own expertise, so you can learn kind of what's going on out there and what people need. And this leads us to the third step. Now, so step one is question. Step two, care. Step three is an interesting thing. I found that designers and innovators are really good at this, really good at combining. And when I say combining, I'm talking about combining ideas. It's like the secret weapon of innovators and designers, which I didn't really realize. They are really good at putting together thoughts, ideas, influences, and they're particularly good at doing it with things that seem unrelated, which I find really, really cool. Again, I'm going to go back to Van Phillips, the prosthetic foot designer. He told me that when he was designing that prosthetic foot, he was combining all these really interesting, unrelated ideas. Like he became fascinated with a cheetah and with the tendons of a cheetah and the way they move and the way they compress, okay? At the same time, he also became really interested in the springboard, the spring mechanism of a diving board. You know, what makes a diving board spring so much? And he studied the engineering of that. And then there were crazy things, like he was really interested in, he told me he was fascinated by the idea of a C-shaped metal blade. He had this image in his head, and the reason why was because when he was growing up, his dad had owned like an ancient Chinese sword that was curved, a curved sword, and he always thought it was really fascinating that metal could be curved like that and could be really flexible and strong. So, you know, all of these things were kind of floating around in his head, and he starts to connect them, and he starts to put them together. And all of those things end up being, you know, the thing that results in his innovation. Here it is, being worn by actually an Olympic athlete named Oscar Pistorius. But you know, this final creation had the cheetah tendencies. It had the springboard of the diving board. It had the C-shaped metal device on the foot. And it really was interesting to me how, you know, all these crazy sort of random ideas, you know, all came together in his creation. And I think it's because, you know, I've tried to think about this and study this, and, you know, why are designers good at this? Why are they particularly good at making these connections? A lot of them seem to be particularly good at what some people call lateral thinking, which is, you know, most of us, when we try to solve problems, we are very logical and straight ahead in our thinking. And designers are sort of, will look all around. I mean, they'll take ideas from left field and they'll say, can I use this idea? And can I combine this idea with this idea? So it's a kind of open-mindedness that a lot of these innovators have as they're in this process. But I think it's something all of us could, you know, can do and can sort of train our minds to do, to get into the habit of doing this kind of thing. So one of the designers that I interviewed uses this term, smart recombinations, to talk about, you know, what it is you end up with when you put these things together, when you put these ideas together. And when I was doing the book, it was just filled with smart recombinations. I realized that smart recombinations are like everywhere. You know, people are taking this idea that exists and that idea that exists, and they are putting them together in a really interesting way. So I think that, just want to give you one example that's from the book. This is the clocky. And this was one of the designers in the book who actually put wheels on an alarm clock. And the reason she did this was because she was having trouble waking up in the morning. She would always turn off her alarm clock, as a lot of us do. And so her idea was, what if I put wheels on a clock and I design it so the clock rolls off the night table in the morning as it's beeping and forces me to get up and chase after it to turn it off. And it actually worked, and it actually became a very successful product for her. So, so this third step, I'm going to wrap this up. This third step of combining, to me, is kind of the step together part of the dance. This brings us to the fourth step. Now, the fourth step is really important. This is where you kind of jump forward towards the innovation. And the thing that lets you jump forward toward the innovation is the ability to commit. I found that innovators and designers are really great at committing to their ideas. And what I mean by that is they give shape to their ideas, they give form to their ideas, they sketch like crazy. I think Deborah has talked about this a lot in her book. And designers and innovators, whether they're sketching or building prototypes or whatever, are really good at making ideas real. And that becomes a key to their success. Because once you do that, once you make ideas real, they're out there in the world. One thing about making ideas real is you have to be willing to fail, because when you prototype, when you put ideas out there early, you end up with things that aren't quite ready for prime time. So you get a lot of failures. Things have to come back to you. And I think one of the interesting things I found in looking at designers is that they get really comfortable with failure. They get really comfortable with the idea that a failure is not a failure. It's actually just a step where you learn. It's a step that gets you to the next step. Van Phillips, again, when he was designing that prosthetic foot, it just kind of, he was kind of dealing with a situation where he would make prototypes, he would try to run on them, and they would break under him. And this happened over and over again. And because he was such an experienced, or he was such a determined designer, he just kept going, And I talked to him about that, and I said, wasn't it frustrating to have these prototypes kind of break under you? And he said, great line, he said, every time something broke, I learned. And that's kind of, I think, a key to, what makes these designers successful. So the 4 steps are, to sum up, let's get to it. Question, right? By asking stupid questions. Care enough to find out what people actually need. Combine ideas that seem unrelated via lateral thinking. And commit to bringing ideas to life through visualization and prototyping. Lots of great projects that I studied in the book. Do this, Nike Plus. If you look through Nike Plus, you see that they went through this question, care, combine, and commit process, and that's how they got there. Nike Plus is itself a smart recombination. And I just found that, over and over again, as I went through as I went through business models, as I went through even, advertising models, whatever, I found that a lot of great innovations you could sort of follow through this process. And so it all comes together to form this thing, the Catalyst Dance, which I think is kind of a decent model. There's a lot of innovation models out there. It's kind of a decent one. It's simple. It's accessible. It's easy to remember. And, as Obama urges us, all of us, to innovate, my hope is that, lots of people will begin doing the Catalyst Dance. And we may see spontaneous flash mobs of Catalyst dancers forming. And if that happens, it will either mean we've all gone crazy or that we are all just innovating our asses off. So I will let these dancers take this out, but I just want to say thanks for listening, and it's good to be here.